I'm delighted to be here with you, at least over the airwaves. And greetings from Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is where I am, here where the southwestern deserts meet the Rocky Mountains. A beautiful day here. I hope it is in Iowa too. So I'm going to do a talk for you out of my new book, Wild New World, which has been out for almost a year, and it's about to come out in paperback in October of this fall. And it's a book, as you'll see, that is a significant sort of background book for the passage of the Endangered Species Act 50 years ago. And so the talk I'm going to do, because this is a fairly big book, it covers a lot of topics. It's a 390-page book that, as you'll hear, covers a long time span and a lot of different animals. I'm going to do a talk that will do some of the general approaches that I take in writing, or I took in writing Wild New World, but I'll try to focus on a specific species at one point in the story to give you some idea of how the story of this particular animal played out in American history. And then at the very end, I'll turn to the Endangered Species Act itself. So let me simply begin by saying to you that global climate change is not the first time that humanity has remade the earth. My current book, Wild New World, covers 66 million years of North American history, from the Chicxulub impact, that's the asteroid impact that took out the dinosaurs, down to early 2022, basically down to a year ago. I think that kind of coverage probably qualifies it as the sort of book some people call big history. It was inspired by Yuval Harari's Sapiens. I'm sure many of you have read that book, as well as Jared Diamond's various books, particularly probably his Guns, Germs, and Steel. So it's that kind of book. It covers a much longer time span than most books that you think of as historical works do. And it tells a story that really sort of forced me to take a 20,000-foot view of human history. Writing Wild New World made me understand how crucial Earth's animal life has been throughout the human story, not just in American history over the last 50 years, but throughout our story as a species. In fact, as I'm going to tell you a bit more about later on in this talk, the biodiversity crisis we today call the sixth extinction is actually a slow motion phenomenon that we humans initiated long before modern glaciers began to melt. And it began a long time ago to change Earth dramatically. All books exist because writers are compelled by something. And in this case, one of the motivating circumstances for me had to do with my oldest memory. This is a story I tell in the book to help myself and to help readers understand something about the ideology that old worlders brought to America with respect to humans and other animals. So I'll just tell you a truncated version of it this afternoon. I had my first animal companion, a little yellow chicken that I fed and watered and played with when I was 4 years old. Our primary play was chase, and one day as we raced through the house, dodging sewing machines and dining tables and couches, I miscalculated, as clumsy little 4-year-olds do, I suppose, and I stepped on my little chicken and I killed her. Oh. So as we were burying my little bird in the backyard, I turned to my mom sobbing with a question. Mom, I at least get to have Chicky again in heaven, don't I? So my mother was a good Southern Methodist who was known all her life for delivering the unpainted version of things, whether you were 50 years old or 4 years old. And she responded with a take on the Western view of animals that has ended up haunting me for a lot of my life. To my questions, she said this: "Why, no, honey, chickens don't go to heaven. They're different from you and me. They don't have souls. You were made in the image of God and have an everlasting soul, so you'll get to have a life after death and go to heaven. But animals don't get to do that. They just die." I can tell you that even as a 4-year-old, that kind of human exceptionalism rang false to me. But the idea of it lingered in a disturbing way in my mind for most of my life. And I think it's one of the things that set me on the course to one day write a book like Wild New World. I wrote this book for other reasons too, and I'll just mention a couple of them to you this afternoon. I've more than once been stunned that Americans seem to remember so little about the marvelous biological diversity our continent once held, or understand the realities of how we lost so much magic from the world. Most of us recall a kind of a shorthand story that once there were millions of buffalo and then there were almost none of them. But who really remembers anymore that 2 centuries ago, Atlantic shorelines still harbored a northern hemisphere penguin, the great auk, that there was still an eastern prairie chicken, the heath hen, until the early 1930s. When my own grandparents were alive in Louisiana, passenger pigeons, once the most numerous bird on earth, still flew through American skies. As they had done for 5 million years, wolves were still engineering continental ecologies everywhere until a century ago. America's own parrot, the Carolina parakeet, continued to lend a tropical color to eastern forests only 90 years ago. Ivory-billed woodpeckers were still available for ornithologists to study as late as the 1940s. Henry David Thoreau once lamented that in 1850s New England, the 1850s, he was not able to experience what he called an entire heaven and an entire earth because human demigods who had come before him had robbed him of those experiences. I used that phrase from Thoreau as a title for one of my chapters because so few modern Americans seem to understand what having an entire earth might have meant. That absence of memory doesn't just make restoration of wolves, for instance, more difficult in our own time. It sometimes even makes me wonder about our willingness to forget about our own impacts on the world and whether humans 2 or 3 centuries from now, say in the 23rd or 24th centuries, will even understand that they live on an earth that previous generations, ours, overheated, and whether they'll wonder what the planet was like, or as so many of us seem to do today, just assume that the world we live in is normal. So a book that covers 66 million years gets to engage a great many topics, obviously. And before I get into some discussion of a specific one of them, let me mention a few of the ones that appear in Wild New World. Among them is how America acquired the rich and distinctive bestiary of animals, of birds, mammals, reptiles, that greeted the first human arrivals so many thousands of years ago. Humanity's deep time and intimate relationships with other animals is another theme that I try to unravel, manifests even today as part of a surviving human neurological and limbic hardwiring in our bodies that still informs us about the other creatures around us. The book investigates American elephants and why we no longer have elephants in North America. How people who established our first coast-to-coast culture 13,000 years ago, Clovicia the Beautiful, is what I call the title of the chapter that investigates this culture, forever transformed ecologies on the continent. How it was that in the 10,000 years that followed Clovis, native people largely managed to preserve American biological diversity, and for that long a span of time. And of course, you can't write a book like this without going into how naturalists who came to America, Mark Catesby, William Bartram, John James Audubon, Ernest Thompson Seton, Vernon Bailey and Florence Miriam Bailey in the 20th century, and Adolph and Olaus Murie, Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, all those famous names in American natural history unlocked the secrets, so many secrets of America's wild animals. I investigate why, this is a question that I've struggled with for a long time, why aren't bison wild animals in America anymore? How in the process of creating what we've long called the greatest nation on earth, America's market-based economy made possible 400 years of the most widespread destruction of animals that's discoverable anywhere in world history. And then we pronounce that an act of civilization. This story I tell also involves a theory of first contact. The Americas were the last continents on Earth that humans found, and we were repeatedly new to the place. First contact theory assumes that beings can only respond to the new with the ideas that are already in their heads. So first contact in several forms, biological first contact, for example, where animals with no prior experience with humans had to learn to fear us, and cultural first contact, when Europeans and native people engaged in big conceptual misses about one another, play significant roles in Wild New World. But I'm also interested in writing about what I call continental first contact, when more recent Americans failed to appreciate the rich, diverse, and ancient ecologies we had inherited. Acting on old world traditions we brought over to America, we strove to remake America and the United States in the image of Europe, in the image of countries that had long before destroyed all their own largest and most charismatic animals. Even when the United States created a system of vast public lands, unlike anything Europe possessed, with respect to wild animals, we're still struggling to imagine our way out of the blinders of continental first contact. The thoughts that are in our heads about animals make up another theme. I'm concerned throughout our story with how humans saw themselves in relation to the other animals around us in the world. And so I investigate, for instance, Neanderthal practices and beliefs towards other animals, as well as the 35,000-year-old art of almost godlike animals that our ancestors painted on the cave walls of Western Europe. This oldest form of human worship, and I think that's what it was, featured something that we probably find fairly quaint today, what anthropologists call therianthropes, figures that merge humans and other animals, sometimes lions, sometimes bison, and other creatures too, into a singular animal that combines the characteristics of humans and the other creatures. I see that ancient feeling of kinship We are them and they are us across the 10,000 years of Native America prior to the arrival of Old Worlders here. America's indigenous stories, in fact, are often accounts of kinship ceremonies performed to placate animal deities so that when humans overreached or failed to pay proper respect, ceremonies could repair any rifts so that when called on to renew the ancient pact, the animals came dancing, as the stories often put it. Europeans, as we know, arrived with very different religious ideas, ideas that sprang from a long tradition of herding domesticated animals in the old world. From Greek and biblical sources, Europeans believed we were made in the image of a deity that lived in the sky, and were convinced as a result that we possessed a magical, immortal spirit that set us apart and made us exceptional among all animals. We brought with us a religious book asserting at every reading that God had created other animals solely for our use. Into your hand are they delivered, Genesis proclaims. As religions do, Judeo-Christianity explained how the whole world worked. Since a deity had created everything on earth in a state of perfection, extinction was impossible. Religious scholars believe that predators like wolves, an annoyance to Old Worlders' domesticated herds, originated with Adam's fall from grace, and that destroying them could recreate humanity's original situation in the garden. Add the capitalist market to that, and that kind of distance between the human animal and other animals allowed Europeans to see the wild creatures of America primarily as a form of potential wealth, not living kin, but natural resources and commodities in the global economy. So in an early United States whose citizens believed animals could be sources of capitalist wealth, who believed extinction could never happen because creation had made a perfect, unchanging world, tracking this dam of old world certitude to see reality eventually would require a genius like Charles Darwin, whose blockbuster books revealed the great secret of evolution, verifying with science the ancient dictum that we were the same as all the life around us, a spawn of Earth's evolutionary river. It's important to remember that the first of Darwin's books, though, On the Origin of Species, is only 164 years old. Human exceptionalism has the inertia of millennia behind it. There's also that sixth extinction I mentioned, which has different origins than most of us assume. Unlike the fifth extinction, when an asteroid strike wiped out 75% of Earth's life in a few weeks, the sixth extinction is human-caused and has unspooled across the last 35,000 years. A 2018 National Academy of Sciences study described the loss of some 300 mammal species and 2.5 billion years as a result of distinctive genetics as humans spread out of Africa and found America as close to a worst case scenario for biodiversity on Earth. Then, starting 5 centuries ago, scores of remaining species, many of them like passenger pigeons that had been natives in America for 15 million years, proved incapable of surviving a mere 4 centuries as targets of market capitalism. The losses since 1500, during which America's great auks, passenger pigeons, parrots, and most recently ivory bills became direct or indirect victims of capitalism, has cost us another 500 million years of Earth's evolved faunal genetics. The authors of that study insist that it will take us millions of years to recover the sacrifice of so much genetic diversity on Earth. Our new genomic science is now telling us a great many things about this story we were unable to answer before. Using museum specimens with preserved DNA, this new science has been able to do things like assess the genetic health of mammoths, of great auks, of passenger pigeons, and Carolina parakeets on the eve of their extinction, and to identify the likely causes for their disappearances. Genomic science done for the last American mammoths, for example, who survived on Wrangel Island in the Bering Sea until 4,000 years ago, has given us a new window into the extinctions at the end of the Pleistocene 10,000 years ago. Isolated by human hunting and changing ecology into small populations that were so separated they couldn't share their genes and preserve healthy variability, some of our species, very much like we believe happened with those last Wrangel Island mammoths, seem to have succumbed to what we now refer to as genomic meltdown, the inability to continue to reproduce. Wild New World takes seriously the stories of a great many animals, from hummingbirds to grizzly bears, and some, like the horses that evolved and lived here for 50 million years, it tracks to the unusual ecological problems they present today. Others, like beavers or sea otters, on whose backs the first American millionaires were made, are stories of collapse and recovery. But maybe no American animal offers such a revealing mirror to this country's soul as the wolf. So for the next few minutes, I want to tell you a little bit about the wolf story in America. Some 5.3 million years ago, an indigenous family, the predatory canids, emerged to how what I've thought of for a number of years now as the original American national anthem. They became one of our great evolutionary contributions to the planet. The Canidae family, the wolves and dogs of the world, are thus indigenous to the Americas, evolving in the Southwest before ultimately spreading around the globe. Then by 30,000 years ago, the wolves that never left America, red wolves, eastern wolves, plus native dire wolves and coyotes, were rejoined here by returning waves of gray wolves migrating back to America from Eurasia, where gray wolves had been for some 3 million years. Back in America, these gray wolves of at least 4 different types probably outcompeted dire wolves, which is very likely what happened to dire wolves, to drive them to their extinction. Important to their history and ours, all these wolf types made up what biologists refer to as allotaxa, species closely enough related to hybridize with one another. In an ancient North America inhabited by native people who never domesticated and herded wild ungulates, wolves, coyotes, and other predators freely played their ancient roles as keystone predators, shaping continental ecologies from the top down. But that role was challenged with the arrival of Old Worlders in numbers 400 years ago. The Puritan colony in Massachusetts was barely a decade old when, in his book, New England's Prospect, William Wood wrote of the wolf as a very special problem for colonizers. True, since in America, as he put it, it was never known yet that a wolf ever set upon a man or a woman. These wolves seemed different from those in Europe's fairy tales and memories. But wolves in such numbers were unexpected. Wood was the first to imagine how wonderfully splendid a wolf-free America might be. But in the 1630s New England, he despaired that there just was little hope of their utter destruction, as he put it. From the start, the wolf then was an American animal of special concern for Europeans. But the question, of course, is why? Part of the answer was unfamiliarity. England's wolves hadn't lasted beyond the 1400s. So Virginians and New Englanders were living among wolves for the first time in their lives. And as William Wood implied, they didn't like it in the least. Then there were their imported cultural traditions. When you had herded domesticated animals for 8,000 years, and religion was your way of understanding the world, it was easy to see wolves as a kind of supernatural malediction. After all, didn't wolves share the yellow eyes that medieval illustration often gave to Satan? Eastern wolves found in northern New England and red wolves, which range from Texas to southern New England, were the common devourers that Wood warned about. Canids distinct from the gray wolves farther west in America. Some of these eastern wolves were black, another suspicious mark. While Abenakis and Narragansetts admired wolves for their bravery, their hunting skills, and their devotion to mates and packs, Europeans saw the same wolves as degenerate cowards, the definition of evil and cruelty in nature. The reality was that wolf social lives and ecological niches were in fact similar to our own, which of course is why tamed wolves became our first animal companions, the first animals we ever domesticated some 20,000 years ago. Wolf societies were configured much like hunter-gatherer bands, in fact, and in both, the leadership tended to be matriarchal. While the alpha female wolf directs the pack's movements, the larger males, especially those between about 2 and 5 years old, are the primary hunters. Europeans imagined America's wolves as vicious, efficient killing monsters. In the real world, a very different process was playing out. Chasing down and neck wrestling big animals armed with hooves and antlers is dangerous in the extreme. Wolves actually go then for low-hanging fruit. They scavenge animals already dead when possible, and on the hunt, they try for fawns and young animals or injured or old ones, the ones that are the least dangerous to them. Even then, among the white-tailed deer that wolves were primarily hunting in the eastern and southern forests of colonial America, their chase success usually dipped as low as 10%. But wolf natural history was invisible to the colonials because what the new settlers really wanted was a wolf-free America. Wood's Massachusetts colony, in fact, passed the first wildlife law in colonial history. It was a bounty on dead wolves, passed in 1630. John James Audubon left the future a chilling account of how wolves experienced the colonial war on them. This was in 1814 when the attitudes of Americans towards wolves had hardened into a kind of rare viciousness. Spending the night with a farmer on the Vincennes Trace, Audubon accompanied his host to a capture pit that held 3 wolves. The wolves' sin, they had attacked the farmer's loose stock in a country by then bled of almost all his deer, bison, and elk. Climbing into the pit, the farmer, one by one, severed the wolves' hamstrings with his pocket knife, exhibiting as little fear as if he had been marking lambs, Audubon wrote. Then he dragged the wolves out of the pit so that his dogs could tear them to pieces. Audubon helped him pull up the largest, a black male wolf in the prime of life. The naturalist described this beast of old world horror stories as motionless with fright, as if dead, its disabled legs swinging to and fro, its jaws wide open, and the gurgle in its throat alone indicating that it was alive. Petrified with fear, the black wolf offered no resistance. It took the dogs less than a minute to stop the gurgling and extinguish his life. Over the ensuing centuries, wolves came in for this kind of particularly wanton cruelty again and again. Hardly anyone remembers now that there was once a viable rural occupation in America known as wolfer. When strychnine became cheaply available in America in 1834, with no restrictions on its use, of course, poisons offered a new way to make money off nature. Unlike trapping or shooting, poison didn't even require any skill. You just baited a carcass and then headed to camp to enjoy life while strychnine did its work. Approaching a carcass that baited, wolfers would start finding victims a quarter mile from the bait animal, their corpses appearing sprayed across the landscape as if by some spinning centrifuge. The details are gruesome. Strychnine killed through asphyxiation, a death preceded by convulsive cramping so violent it almost twisted animals to death. A party in the Texas Panhandle once picked up 64 wrenched wolf bodies one morning, barely a mile from their camp. They made $4,000 that winter, about $93,000 today. In Kansas, a hunter named James Mead once poisoned 82 wolves to death on a single morning. Montana's territorial government was so committed to shielding cattle and sheep raisers from predators that in the 1880s, it spent 2/3 of its annual territorial budgets supporting a whole class of wolfers in the territory. Between 1883 and 1928, Montana shelled out money to kill an astounding 111,545 wolves and nearly 900,000 coyotes. Wolf pelts in the Old West traded as money, worth $1 a piece on the western frontier, and if you could get them all the way to New York, $2 a piece. And I have to tell you, it was not just wolves in America. Bison, of course, by the 1880s had been reduced from 30 million animals at the beginning of the 19th century to fewer than 1,000 by 1886. Plume birds on the southern coasts, particularly Florida, like snowy egrets and great blue herons, were slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands for feathers for fashion. In 1 year, 192,960 snowy egrets and herons were killed by southern market hunters and sold on the markets for animal parts in England. In 1 week, in the year 1886, 400,000 American hummingbirds were sold on the markets in London. In Bozeman, Montana, in the 1870s, market hunters killing and shipping the hides and pelts of wolves, coyotes, elk, pronghorns, mule deer, and bighorn sheep down the Missouri River made the equivalent in today's money of $1.6 million in a single year. And passenger pigeon hunts in the Midwest in the 1870s and 1880s reduced birds, the most numerous bird on earth, whose numbers had reached into the billions, to the point where by the 1890s, they were down to scores of birds left, only scores. One hunt in Michigan in the 1880s drew 100,000 people who slaughtered passenger pigeons on their nests before they could rear their young. So it wasn't just wolves alone, or even bison, the animal we're most familiar with. I have to tell you, in this ability to kill animals en masse, Americans were unmatched in the world. By the 1920s, as flappers and jazz and Hollywood were captivating American cities, the wolf had become a kind of golden-eyed lightning rod that distilled much of the American wildlife story. Attempts to make the United States into a clone of European countries, the loss of so many ancient species in America, and a battle between advocates of the old folkloric traditions from Europe and those of the brand new science of ecology that was emerging in the early 20th century. In an act of self-preservation, a century ago, the nascent U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which was then known as the Biological Survey, had remade itself into the solution to the country's so-called predator problem. One of its famous employees, a naive country boy from Minnesota named Vernon Bailey, had transformed himself into the wolf-killing federal guru Teddy Roosevelt would nickname Wolf Bailey. Everywhere this wolf war was waged on behalf of civilization, livestock interests, and increasingly in the 20th century, on behalf of sport hunters who were told they could now harvest all the animals that predators used to get. If your assignment was to exterminate the wolf, the modern way was not shooting or trapping, but poisoning entire populations. With its new funding, the Biological Survey proceeded to build a plant in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to produce strychnine baits in volume. Chillingly, unsentimentally, the Bureau called that plant the Eradication Methods Lab. And by the 1920s, it was providing 3.5 million poison baits a year to kill wolves and coyotes. At one point, Vernon Bailey inquired of his boss, C. Hart Merriam, the director of the Biological Survey, about the proper use of strychnine to kill a wolf, and what Bailey said, "I hope will be a humane 3 minutes." This was C. Hart Merriam's response, because any expression of mercy towards wolves was a political faux pas. So Merriam said this: "You had better go at once to the hospital in Albuquerque, inasmuch as no sane man could possibly make such an absurd and utterly preposterous statement as this. You are obviously in need of mental treatment." Merriam then went on, "We want the cattleman behind us. Sabe?" Federal hunters soon enough grasped that the wolf's fatal flaw was loyalty to its social group. Such was the wolf's affection for mates, pups, and pack members that killing one meant, as a Bureau hunter put it, you could quickly kill all the members of whole families of wolves with unmistakable evidence that the remaining members of the wolf family have been seeking the lost member. The architects of this program took their message to the American public with a series of canned newspaper articles akin to those lauding the G-men hunting crime celebrities like Al Capone and John Dillinger. U.S. agents stalk the desperados of the animal world was the title of one of the most popular of those canned articles. In the mid-1940s, two of those federal architects of the wolf war, Stanley Young and E.A. Goldman, finally published their coda to centuries of American wolf killing, the Wolves of North America, they call it. From New England to Virginia and westward to the Midwest, they wrote exultantly, wolves were now entirely gone. The Rocky Mountain states, with all their public lands, had barely 100 remaining wolves by the 1940s. California had fewer than 50. Aside from Alaska, the only places in America that still had a few wolves were along the border with Canada in the Great Lakes and in the Mid-South, where a handful of remaining red wolves were beginning to hybridize with coyotes that were now pushing towards a wolf-free East. All this the authors treated as a celebration of a 4th-century victory, something they compared to our victories over Nazi Germany and Japan. There was a distinct group, however, for which a wolf-free America did not seem like a celebratory step or a good idea at all. Without bothering to research its assumptions, the Biological Survey had reflexively adopted the European folk position. Predators were disposable. A civilized America modeled on Europe demanded their absence. But from the 1920s through mid-century, disciples of the brand new science of ecology began to argue that there might be ancient and dynamic equilibria at work in an America that had long featured wolves. And the way to find that out was actually to research the role that wolves had played in our ecologies. Another might be to offer predators like wolves permanent refuge in America's national parks, an idea that dumbfounded the Biological Survey. We faced the opposition, its director told his employees, of people who actually want to see the mountain lion, the wolf, the coyote, and the bobcat perpetuated as part of the wildlife of the country. One of the scientists who was keenly interested in this debate was a young Yale-trained forester named Aldo Leopold. Posted to the Carson National Forest in New Mexico, in Santa Fe, Leopold met Estelle Berger, the woman who would become his wife, who had a brother who was the president of the New Mexico Wool Growers Association. But Leopold soaked up the world with an open mind, and one of the issues he began to study was the response of prey animals to predator removal. He did so because of a new but recurring phenomenon in America: the explosion and then rapid die-off of ungulate populations where predators had been removed. Ecologists call this an eruption. Leopold could find historical records of only 2 eruptions before 1900 in America, but he counted a whopping 42 of them that played out between 1900 and 1945. At the same time Leopold was studying eruptions, a National Park Service ecologist named named Adolph Murray landed the research project the ecologists had long called for. By mid-century, Mount McKinley in Alaska was the only American park that still had wolves. So Murray went to Alaska and spent 3 years engaged in the unthinkable, actually observing and studying wolves interacting among themselves and with their prey. Anyone today who reads the classic that resulted, The Wolves of Mount McKinley, can't help but share Murray's excitement at studying the mythic American animal Europeans had been reflexively trying to exterminate for centuries. Though Bureau policy had been too arrogant or myopic to see it, what Adolph Murray realized was that the relationship between wolves, their prey, and all manner of subsequent ecological connections influencing other species, right down to vegetation that grew, were ancient to the continent, predating Europeans by thousands or even millions of years. Our assumptions on our arrival that the best thing we could do was to weed the place of so many of its wild creatures had been mindless arrogance. Murray did one other thing readers of his book never forgot. He brought the wolves he studied to life as individuals. Dandy, Rubber Mask, and Grandpa were all unique creatures. Pack members he studied seemed affectionate and caring of one another. These were not the wolves portrayed by the animals that old worlders had brought ashore. They weren't the wolves the Bureau's public relations articles implied were the gangsters of the animal world. They were the wolves that had been in America all along. The Wolves of Mount McKinley was the country's first entree into a modern sensibility about American wildlife in general, and it came out at roughly the same time The Wolves of North America by the Bureau's leaders appeared. Aldo Leopold reviewed the latter book in 1945. He knew the Bureau men had never questioned the old world model, but European countries had nothing comparable to the vast wild public lands Americans had set aside. The wolf war we'd unthinkingly engaged in was not scientific, Leopold wrote. It reflected, as he put it, the folk naturalists of the past rather than the wildlife ecologists of today. Ouch. In 1949, America's star biologist finally published a book that would launch a great many Americans into the 20th century's age of ecology and ultimately the passage of the Endangered Species Act. Leopold's A Sand County Almanac was a game changer. In vivid poetic passages, it introduced the world to insights that were near epiphanies for many. The genius that built the United States had always been self-interest. Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill had hit on a trait that's fundamental to human evolution. But Leopold did not say that an act was right when it preserved humanity or human economics, the easy position of a self-absorbed species. Instead, he called on his readers to think of innate rights, among them the simple right to exist of other species in an ecological community that included us. A Sand County Almanac's most unforgettable scene, as you know, was Leopold's own myth of personal change and redemption. His essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, was not merely a poetic rendering of his view that we had a chance to create a distinctively American policy towards predators and big wild creatures. Leopold's story of once shooting a wolf himself, watching the green fire die in his eyes, and then coming to realize what a miscalculation he had made, offered America a whole new destination. We were wrong. I was wrong, he implied, but it's not too late. I'll close this talk this way. Through much of our history, we've told ourselves that apart from the few species we saved to be able to hunt, it was inevitable that the continent's wild animals vanish. They were the collateral damage of progress and prosperity. In fact, though, losing animals, just like rescuing them now, has almost always been a deliberate choice. 50 years ago this year, we made the very deliberate choice to pass the Endangered Species Act of 1973, finally reversing the myopic destruction that had stood as shorthand for American colonization. The ESA rested on a premise that other living species, which both indigenous philosophies and Darwinian science teach us are our earthly kin, possess an essential right, the right to exist. The US Supreme Court called the ESA the most comprehensive legislation for endangered species ever enacted by any nation. I argue in Wild New World that passing the ESA represents one of those American moments, joining the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the abolition of slavery, and the creation of the national parks, that shows who we are as a people. The ESA became law when saving the world was not political. It passed 482 to 12 in the two houses of Congress in 1973 and was signed into law by a Republican president, Richard Nixon. And it hasn't just brought back bald eagles and condors and wolves and recovered more than 50 other species in the half century it's existed, with another 1,618 species currently on the threatened and endangered list. In the International Union for Conservation of Nature's new green status list, U.S. species now fare significantly better than those anywhere else in the world because of our ESA and its recovery programs. Despite our own success with the ESA and our signal restoration projects, today across the planet, a third of our 27,000 vertebrate species are now in decline, with a quarter of those possibly facing entire extinction. Since the 1970s, in this country alone, our bird population has dropped by 3 billion, a stunning 29% decline. As a result of climate change, a third to a half of our species are shifting their ranges, at least the ones that can do so. While in America, we still have hopes for grand recoveries like jaguars, for example, or to have bison be wild again, we're also still losing species like ivory-billed woodpeckers from the earlier phase of our history when we de-buffalo, de-wolfed, and de-pigeoned the continent and engaged, as I said, in the largest destruction of wildlife anywhere in world history. Despite a recent claim by the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee that the ESA is an outdated part of American history, in the big context of our national story, the Endangered Species Act of 1973 is firmly on the short list of America's best ideas for our future. It's proof that nothing in history is inevitable and that we can find it in ourselves to change. So in a nation that endeavors to lead the world by example, in the ESA, we have evidence that change is within us. When we needed a Hail Mary to slow and even reverse what seemed unstoppable forces of destruction for hundreds of years, we Americans actually managed to do it. That gives me hope that mindless human destruction and loss aren't inevitable, that we can, in fact, choose to change and to go on and save the world for ourselves in the future. So thank you for listening to that. I appreciate it very much and appreciate you inviting me to participate.
We have questions?
Don't be afraid to go first.
Where I live, it's pretty common for people to hunt coyotes just for fun. Is that going to impact our ecology in any significant way?
You all heard her question, I guess, right? About
Yeah.
coyote hunting for recreational fun. That's common across every state in the union. And of course, coyotes now exist in every state except for Hawaii. They have not yet stowed away on a ship and gotten to the Big Island, but they're in every state in the union. They got into the 49th state out of our 50, which was Delaware in 2011. So coyotes are among us everywhere. They've spread across America for all kinds of reasons. I mean, some of you may know that I, a few years, wrote a book called Coyote America. That was a biography of this species and its story in American history. And it's really quite a roller coaster story. You know, the truth, as a response to your question, is that sacrificing coyotes probably doesn't alter ecologies very much for this reason. Coyotes evolved a very fascinating adaptation to 5 million years of being harassed by bigger canids like various wolves. And that particular adaptation is called fission fusion. There are only 19 mammal species around the world that have come up with this fission fusion adaptation. We humans happen to be one of the 19. And what it means is that these are animals in coyote terms that can function in fission mode as singles and as pairs, and also in fusion mode as packs. And they can do both equally well. And the reason they seem to evolve this particular ability is because when wolves would harass them, they would tend to scatter, disband their packs, scatter as singles and pairs across the landscape, and often colonize new places to get away from wolves. And so that's the adaptation that they brought to bear when we started trying to wipe them out. I mean, and we killed millions upon millions of them, more than 5 million of them between the 1920s and the 1960s. By the 1960s, ecologists studying coyotes who were trying to figure out why wolves, for example, were almost gone, and so many other animals in America were almost gone, but somehow coyotes were still here and were even expanding their range into new places, realized that coyotes were so adaptable that they not only had the fission fusion adaptation, but that when they were harassed and persecuted, they often had larger litters. And when their numbers were reduced by harassment, they were able to get more of their young to adulthood than was the case otherwise, so that you could actually take out 70% of the coyote population in a given area, and they would rebuild their population back to carrying capacity within a year or two. So taking coyotes out doesn't really have a tremendous effect on local ecologies, but I will say it's a meaningless act other than engaging in a kind of recreational cruelty of killing other animals, which is obviously not a very admirable thing to do, because coyotes are able to replenish their populations so easily. So, I mean, I'm an admirer of coyotes. I grew up in Louisiana when they were colonizing.
This room will automatically shut down in 60 seconds.
What will shut, what did it say will shut down?
Yes.
Yeah, an automatic voice shutdown, I think, something like that. I don't know if that referred to me or.
This is going really I know. Is recording will shut down?
I don't know if that's, I think that has to do with the room technology, because I don't recognize that from Zoom.
Yeah, they're very. Anyway.
Okay, well then maybe I should.
Keep on going.
I'll shut up and let you guys ask another question.
Yeah, it might be dangerous.
Somebody.
Someone have another question?
Yeah.
David,
Is it
was
on?
that?
In the early chapters of your book, you talked about, I guess what I would call prehistoric humans, the Clovis period and so on in the United States, and how those people exterminated at least some of the megafauna. Is that any different than what we're doing now? Or how do you compare?
Well, I think they probably didn't do it in order to sell mammoth parts, for example, to people back in Asia. They weren't doing it, in other words, for a market economy. They were doing it as part of their day-to-day survival. But the animals in North America were particularly susceptible to the arrival of highly skilled hunters like the Clovis people, who came out of 40,000 generations of hunters in human evolution and arrived with a technological toolkit that was really advanced. These people were really skilled. As you know from having read this, I mean, I tell a story in that chapter about a group of Clovis hunters surrounding a mammoth herd in what is now southern Arizona that had 2 adults, a bull and a cow, and 14 adolescents and calves. They killed all 14 of the adolescents with 1 point each. I mean, we know this because of the archaeological sites from this particular kill. And then the mammoth cow evidently fought them, trying to protect her young. She was found several miles away with 8 Clovis points in her. And the bull was found in another location, his remains, with 2 Clovis points in him. In other words, they managed to kill an entire herd of mammoths with fewer than 24 Clovis point spears, the cow requiring 8 and all the others requiring only 1 or 2. So they were really good at this. And of course, they were taking on animals like mammoths that had a really slow population recovery. I mean, mammoths, like most elephants, they don't reach sexual maturity until they're 7 or 8 years old. Their gestation period for having young, and usually only 1 or 2 at birth, is very long. And so they're what biologists call K species. They can't recover their populations quickly. And they also, in America, because it's isolated from the rest of the world, have never confronted humans as predators before. And so many of these species, I mean, we don't know about all of them. And there's the real mysteries, obviously, of the Pleistocene. The extinction of horses and camels in North America, where horses survive in Asia and in Africa, and camels survive in South America, is still a mystery that we haven't been able to explain. And as I said in the talk I did, we also are beginning to think that some new arrivals like gray wolves probably outcompeted certain species like dire wolves, and that by driving certain creatures into these small discrete populations isolated from one another, that humans may have helped initiate a kind of a genomic meltdown among some of them, that these things may have contributed. And there was just an article in Science about 2 or 3 weeks ago that came from studies of animals in La Brea tar pits, indicating that the fire ecology that humans brought to North America may have played a really significant role in bringing about the Pleistocene extinctions. But those extinctions, which were, by the way, good thing to bring up in your question, those were the most significant wide-scale extinctions of large animals in all of North American history, and produced a completely different North American world after all these animals were gone. It doesn't seem to have been, as I said at the outset here, for the same kind of reasons, that being a market economy sort of exchange. These were people who were arriving in a kind of an Eden that had never experienced human hunting pressure, and by various means were bringing about over a few 2,000 or 3,000 years the extinction of animals who seemed to be especially vulnerable. What distinguished the more recent extinctions that we again know from genomic science, I mean, there's every indication that animals like passenger pigeons and bison had created the huge numbers that they existed in to survive predation. This was one of the earmarks of their own evolution. And yet, even with animals that existed in vast numbers like this, market economies were able in just 2 or 3 centuries to reduce them from the millions or the billions in the case of passenger pigeons down to the point where they were gone or literally gone. So it's kind of it's a difference in degree, not necessarily in kind, but the degree difference is pretty extraordinary.
I felt a real tension in your talk between optimism and pessimism. You started out by referring to the 6th grade extinction, and then there was, toward the end, a feeling of hope from the Endangered Species Act and its successes. But then you kind of brought us down, at least brought me down after that, by referring to the decline recently in the last 50 years in the bird populations and others. So my question is, where do you stand? Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist, and why?
Well, I'm both, actually. Looking back at the human story, until our growing recognition, I mean, and after all, people out of Western Europe over the last 500 years spread around the globe and have come to dominate it with a particular set of an ideological package, religious and economic, that we brought with us. That story and the story of, for example, the arrival of people like the Clovis hunters into a continent that hadn't experienced large-scale human hunting before, those are cause for some pessimism, but those are also human stories from the past. And I think what we did with the science of ecology, and really starting with Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which is what set ecology in motion as a science 160 years ago, give me cause for optimism that we're able to see reality better now than we've been before. I mean, one of the things I argue in Wild New World is that we humans have struggled ever since the beginnings of our evolution to see the reality of the world around us. It accounts for the so many thousands of different cultural traditions, usually based in religious ideas about how the world works, how various deities influence our course through life, and the actions of great events, disasters, and so forth. I mean, we've struggled to figure out how the world around us works. And I think Darwin managed to give us a scientific grounding, as I said in the talk, for an ancient insight that we once had and seem to have lost. At least people in the Western world seem to have lost it, and quite a number of other people seem to have lost it. And indigenous people appear to have preserved a form of it into the modern age, that we are in fact a part of the evolutionary stream, and that other creatures, rather than just being set on the planet for our own use to whatever wish we bring to bear for recreation and pleasure at their deaths, for example, or at making us rich, that these things are not a really sound way of seeing the reality of the world around us. But I think the science of ecology and quite a number of other sciences since then, genomic science is one I rely on heavily in the book, have given us a way of seeing the world more clearly, much more clearly than we ever have before. So while I'm pessimistic about the human past, and I tell the stories that I do in Wild New World because I want us to grapple with who we have been for so much of our art and time. I'm optimistic about the last 150 or so years. I mean, that optimism is sort of, it's couched in a realization that not everybody shares in this awareness of the reality of the world. We're still trying to add adherence to it year by year, almost day by day. But I do think we've got a better sense of how the world works than we've ever had before, if we just use it to our advantage. I mean, the same thing is true with climate change. I mean, I think we have to listen to what climate scientists are telling us and stop trying to stick our heads in the sand about it. Because sticking our heads in the sand about killing wild animals is what we have done for a lot of our history until recently. That's a good question, by the way. Thank you.
So I'm curious about the Clovis hunters, as the story you just told. My first reaction was, it sounds like they killed way more animals than they needed. So there's some evidence of humans were already overkilling if they wiped out an entire herd. I don't know how, of course, what the population size of the humans were there, but that to me sort of says, well, way back then we were already killing more than we needed. But my main point is I've done some reading about the extinction of the megafauna, and I know there's some scientists that disagree with the theory that humans caused it. They're not fully on board with that. And I didn't know if you could speak to that other side, what other ideas or other theories are out there. I'm curious about what was happening in Northern Europe and Asia. Certainly there were mammoths and similar kind of megafauna there. Were humans killing those animals too? There's other animals that were dying, as you alluded to, that weren't being hunted. So there must have been something else going on.
Well, most of the animals that died that weren't being hunted were actually predators of the ones that were hunted and were exterminated. But yeah, the reason there are no mammoths in Europe and Asia right now is because they were wiped out. And in roughly the same time period, usually a little earlier in Europe and Asia, because of course people had been there for longer. I mean, Europe and Asia and America have a different story than Africa, for instance. And some parts of Asia, the jungle parts of Asia, where Asian elephants survive, because our argument about this human overkill is that it's animals that are unfamiliar with us that turn out to be particularly vulnerable. And the reason Africa still has many of its large Pleistocene animals like elephants is because That's where humans evolved. And so those creatures had a head start in understanding that humans were part of the predator guild. Now, I will say that, I mean, it's probably a longer story than I can go into here, but my chapter, Clovicia the Beautiful, deals with all the other theories that we've advanced for the extinctions during the Pleistocene. Some of them, the majority of the ones that people have attempted to advance, include climate change at the end of the Pleistocene. It's climate change at the end of the Pleistocene basically hinges around the idea, well, it actually hinges around two notions. The primary one is that at the end of the Pleistocene, the ice ages are ending and an area of warmer climate is introduced in the Holocene, which is absolutely true. The problem with that in North America is that many of the species that disappear, like camels, like mammoths, particularly like Colombian mammoths, which occupy places like Texas and Arizona and Southern California, are essentially warm weather animals. And so warming climates don't take them out. It probably would have impacted woolly mammoths in Alaska and Canada, but it wouldn't have impacted the species of mammoths that live farther south, or horses, or camels, or ground sloths, a whole host of creatures that really did better in warm weather. The other climate argument is that there was a comet strike around 12,000 years ago that may have produced some sort of impact by making the climate much colder for 300 or 400 years. And that particular weather argument as well doesn't seem to hold up logically, because all these animals that were still in North America had just gone through the glacial maximum, which was at about 19,000 years ago, far colder than the one that occurred as a result of the so-called Younger Dryas cometary impact, or whatever the reason for the Younger Dryas cold spell was. So it doesn't seem logical that animals that had just survived a much colder spell would be taken out by a fairly minor cold spell that happens a few thousand years later. There's another theory that somehow disease epidemics got among animals and in North America. And I mean, it's possible, but the problem with that particular one is that, as we know from things like COVID and the influenza epidemic, the Spanish flu epidemic 100 years ago, disease epidemics don't usually take out every single animal. They may take out 70% of a population, or maybe 85% of a population, but they don't take out every animal, because there are always going to be some individuals who have some resistance to a particular disease, and those become the seed stock for which a more resistant population emerges. So what, to me, as I was writing this chapter and reading all the latest work on this, it actually does seem to me that we're coming to something of a consensus that maybe that wasn't there 20 years ago before the emergence of genomic science. But it looks to me as if paleontologists in particular are kind of coming to a consensus that it's probably the arrival of a brand new species, humans, in places that had never had humans before, that produces conditions for the loss of so many animals. As I said, it may not have happened because people just killed every single thing that was out there. There very likely were other conditions, the use of fire ecology, the effect of reducing populations to discrete small numbers that were separate from one another, having other species outcompete some of the older ones. So it's probably a combination of factors, but it seems to me that the consensus that's emerging these days is that humans arriving in America in a place that had never had us before is probably the critical event that produces it. But anyway, all of that is discussed in that chapter in Wild New World, so you can read it for yourself and see what you think.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flores. We're going to have to move on to our last section, and everybody give them a round of applause, please.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me.
We'll get together sometime again, and maybe you can see more books too. Thank you.
Okay, all right, very good. Thanks.
Uh, I think I can probably just talk from here. Our last section is going to be what's next, and it's going to feature